At 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time last night, February 27th, 2026, something happened that has never occurred in the 249-year history of American-Canadian relations. Inside the West Wing of the White House, exactly as the clock struck midnight, a 72-hour ultimatum issued by President Donald Trump to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney officially expired without compliance, without negotiation, and without any acknowledgement whatsoever from Ottawa. What happened in the 16 hours since that deadline passed represents the most consequential breakdown in North American alliance structure since the War of 1812, and I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you. Because what is unfolding right now is not just a trade dispute or political theatre. This is a stress test on whether the international order that has kept North America stable for 8 decades can survive when one leader decides that threats, intimidation, and economic warfare are legitimate tools of diplomacy against our closest ally. You need to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, because what happened at 1 minute past midnight last night set in motion a cascade of decisions that will determine the future of the North American economy, the stability of NATO, and whether the United States can still be trusted by any ally anywhere in the world. If you care about what happens to America's position in the world over the next 3 days, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the 72 hours ahead will determine whether we witness the largest fracture in Western alliance structure since World War II, or whether cooler heads prevail before catastrophic damage becomes permanent. Here's what we know, and the timeline matters enormously, because every single step of this crisis was documented, witnessed, and in many cases recorded. According to 3 independent sources, 2 from the National Security Council and 1 from a senior aide close to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Trump's ultimatum was delivered in writing at 11:59 p.m. on February 24th, during what was supposed to be a routine call between the 2 leaders discussing routine border security coordination. The document, which was transmitted electronically through secure diplomatic channels, contained 4 specific demands that Trump insisted must be met within 72 hours. Multiple sources familiar with the content of that ultimatum, and I'm talking about people who have relationships with both the American diplomatic corps and Canadian Foreign Ministry officials, are telling me that the demands were so extreme, so disconnected from any reasonable negotiating position, that Canadian officials initially believed the document was a draft that had been sent by mistake. The sealed diplomatic cable, which according to procedural protocols should have remained classified for decades, was leaked to 3 separate news organizations within 6 hours of being transmitted. The leak was deliberate, calculated, and according to former State Department official Wendy Sherman, who served under 3 administrations, represented an unprecedented breach, suggesting that someone inside the American diplomatic apparatus wanted the world to see exactly what Trump was demanding. The cable runs 11 pages, single-spaced, and contains language that constitutional scholars are calling the most aggressive assertion of economic coercion against an ally in modern American history. Professor Michael Tierney, who teaches international relations at William and Mary and has advised 4 presidential administrations on alliance management, told reporters within hours that the ultimatum reads less like diplomacy and more like a protection racket, and those are his exact words from an interview that aired on CNN at 7:47 this morning. Based on 20 years of following diplomatic crisis management, my assessment is that what Trump transmitted to Ottawa on February 24th was never intended as a genuine negotiation. This was designed to provoke exactly the response that Mark Carney delivered, and here is what concerns me most about that calculation. Trump needed Carney to reject the ultimatum because what comes next, what is already in motion as I record this at 2:34 p.m. Eastern Time, has been planned for weeks, and the ultimatum was merely the pretext to justify actions that were always going to happen, regardless of Canadian compliance. Now let me show you exactly what happened and why everyone from Wall Street to Brussels to Beijing is talking about nothing else. Here's what the timeline reveals, and I need you to understand that every date, every timestamp, every sequence matters, because this was a cascade of decisions that transformed a manageable disagreement into an existential crisis for the entire North American alliance structure. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the sequence matters enormously. This did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of escalating tensions, strategic miscalculations, and deliberate provocations, and every single step was documented in real time by officials who understood they were witnessing something historically dangerous unfolding. January 14th, 2026. Trump delivers his second inaugural address and includes a passage that Canadian officials immediately flagged as concerning. The president declares that America will no longer tolerate what he calls economic freeloading by allies who benefit from American military protection, while maintaining what he characterizes unfair trade advantages. The speech includes specific mention of Canada's trade surplus in certain sectors, and while the language is heated, it falls within normal range of Trump's rhetorical style. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly issues a measured statement emphasizing the mutual benefits of integrated North American supply chains and expresses confidence that any trade concerns can be addressed through existing frameworks. January 22nd, Trump signs an executive order establishing what he calls the North American Trade Fairness Commission, a new body tasked with reviewing all existing trade agreements with Canada and Mexico to identify what the order characterizes as structural imbalances requiring immediate correction. The order includes language suggesting that if diplomatic negotiations fail to produce results within unspecified timeframes, the president reserves authority to impose corrective measures unilaterally. Trade experts immediately recognize this language as legally dubious, but the order generates minimal attention in American media focused on domestic policy battles. February 3rd. Mark Carney, who became Canada's Prime Minister in October 2025 after leading the Liberal Party to a decisive victory over Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, delivers his first major foreign policy address to Parliament. Carney is not a typical politician. Before entering politics, he served as Governor of the Bank of Canada, then Governor of the Bank of England, making him one of the most credible economic voices on the international stage. His address includes a carefully worded section on Canadian sovereignty in trade policy, emphasizing that while Canada values the American partnership, Ottawa will not accept ultimatums or threats as substitutes for genuine negotiation. The speech is measured, professional, and includes multiple references to the historical partnership and shared values. Canadian officials describe it as standard assertion of national interest within alliance context. February 11th. Trump responds to Carney's speech during a rally in Michigan, and this is where the tone fundamentally shifts. The president calls Carney a globalist banker who thinks he's too smart for his own good, and suggests that Canada has been ripping off American workers for decades while hiding behind our military protection. The language is notably more aggressive than Trump's typical trade rhetoric, and sources close to the White House tell us that Trump was personally offended by Carney's parliamentary address, viewing it as disrespectful pushback against American priorities. February 18th. The North American Trade Fairness Commission releases a preliminary report claiming that Canada maintains unfair advantages in dairy, lumber, and energy sectors that cost American workers hundreds of thousands of jobs annually. The report's methodology is immediately challenged by independent economists who point out selective data usage and fundamental misunderstandings of integrated supply chain economics, but the White House treats the report as definitive evidence requiring immediate action. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick announces that the administration is considering all available tools to correct what he characterizes as structural imbalances. February 21st. Mark Carney delivers a televised address to the Canadian people that becomes the defining moment in his young prime ministership. Speaking from Ottawa, Carney methodically dismantles the American Commission report, citing specific data showing that integrated North American trade benefits both nations nearly equally, and attempting to rebalance through unilateral coercion would devastate industries on both sides of the border. But here's what most people do not know about that address, and it's the detail that triggered everything that followed. At the end of his remarks, Carney looks directly into the camera and says something that Canadian officials describe as the most direct assertion of sovereignty by a Canadian leader in modern history. He states that Canada will engage in good faith negotiation with any partner, but that Ottawa will never, under any circumstances, accept economic threats or ultimatums as legitimate diplomatic tools. and that any attempt to coerce Canadian compliance through tariffs or sanctions will be met with immediate proportional response and a fundamental reassessment of the entire bilateral relationship. Three independent sources who were monitoring Trump's reaction in real time report that the president erupted when he saw Carney's address, viewing the sovereignty language as personal defiance, requiring immediate consequences. According to one source who was in the Oval Office that evening, Trump told advisers that Carney needed to be taught that you don't talk to the President of the United States like that, and that Canada needed to understand that their prosperity depends entirely on American goodwill. This is the context in which the 72-hour ultimatum was conceived, and the sources describe it not as calculated diplomatic strategy, but as personal retaliation elevated to national policy. February 24th, 11:59 p.m. The ultimatum is transmitted to Ottawa through secure diplomatic channels. According to leaked portions of the document, Trump demands that Canada agree within 72 hours to four specific conditions. First, immediate elimination of all tariffs on American agricultural products, with no reciprocal access for Canadian goods. Second, a 15% reduction in Canadian energy export prices to American markets, regardless of global commodity pricing. Third, Canadian acceptance of American authority to unilaterally impose quotas on any Canadian industry deemed by Washington to threaten American workers. Fourth, a formal Canadian statement acknowledging that previous trade agreements were unfairly advantageous to Canada and committing to accept American-dictated terms in all future negotiations. The demands are so one-sided, so disconnected from any conceivable framework of mutual benefit, that Canadian officials initially struggle to formulate an appropriate response. According to sources inside the Prime Minister's office, Carney convenes an emergency cabinet meeting at 1:47 a.m. on February 25th, approximately 90 minutes after receiving the ultimatum. The meeting lasts until 6:23 a.m. and includes participation from former prime ministers, opposition leaders, and provincial premiers in what sources describe as an unprecedented show of national unity. The consensus is immediate and unanimous. Canada will not dignify the ultimatum with point-by-point negotiation, but will instead deliver a response, affirming Canadian sovereignty and willingness to engage in genuine bilateral discussions, while categorically rejecting the premise that threats constitute legitimate diplomacy. Before we get to what happened next, I need to tell you about the man whose response is now triggering a global economic shockwave, because this is not some random politician looking for attention or playing to domestic audiences. Mark Carney is arguably the most credible economic voice to hold national political office anywhere in the Western world in the past 2 decades. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, successfully steering the Canadian economy through the global financial crisis, with virtually no bank failures while other developed nations experienced systemic collapse. He then served as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, becoming the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 325-year history. During his tenure at the Bank of England, he was widely credited with preventing economic chaos following the Brexit referendum and maintaining sterling stability during unprecedented political turmoil. This is someone who has managed trillion-dollar monetary policy decisions, who has negotiated with central bankers and finance ministers across every major economy, who understands global financial markets at a level that few politicians anywhere can match. When Mark Carney speaks about economics, currency stability, or trade policy, markets listen because his track record demonstrates judgment, technical expertise, and immunity to political pressure that is virtually unmatched among contemporary political leaders. His decision to enter politics surprised many observers, but his campaign emphasized bringing technocratic competence to governance and defending Canadian sovereignty within the rules-based international order. He won a decisive mandate in October 2025, with the largest parliamentary majority for a Canadian government in 2 decades, suggesting that Canadian voters specifically chose a leader they believed could stand up to external pressure while managing economic complexity. So when Trump issued an ultimatum expecting capitulation or desperate negotiation, he fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. This is not a politician dependent on American approval or vulnerable to economic intimidation. This is someone who has managed bigger crises than a trade dispute with a president known for backing down when faced with genuine resistance. And according to multiple sources familiar with Carney's thinking, he viewed Trump's ultimatum not as a legitimate negotiating tactic requiring careful response, but as a test of whether Canada would surrender sovereignty in exchange for temporary trade stability, and his answer was going to be unambiguous. February 25th, 9:47 Mark Carney delivers his response in a brief televised statement from Parliament Hill. The statement runs exactly 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Carney speaks in measured, professional tone devoid of anger or defensiveness. He acknowledges receipt of communication from Washington and states that Canada remains committed to constructive dialogue on any legitimate trade concerns within existing frameworks. Then he delivers the language that sources say was specifically designed to leave no ambiguity about Canadian resolve. Carney states that Canada does not accept ultimatums from any nation, that Ottawa will not negotiate under threat of unilateral economic coercion, and that any attempt to impose punitive measures on Canadian commerce will trigger immediate proportional response designed to impose equivalent economic pain on American industries and workers. He concludes by expressing hope that cooler heads will prevail and that the American administration will recognize that alliance partnerships require mutual respect rather than domination. The response is cold, direct, and according to diplomatic analysts, represents the most explicit rejection of American pressure by a major ally since Charles de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's integrated military command in 1966. Markets immediately react, with the Canadian dollar dropping 1.3% within minutes of Carney's statement as currency traders price in escalation risk, but Canadian bond yields actually tighten slightly, suggesting that investors view Carney's government as fiscally credible even amid diplomatic crisis. Trump's response comes at 11:34 a.m. via social media post. The president writes that Carney has made a historic mistake and that Canada will regret choosing economic suicide over partnership. The post includes language suggesting that tariffs and other measures are now inevitable, and that American workers will be protected regardless of Canadian intransigence. The tone is aggressive, but administration officials provide no specifics about timing or scope of threatened measures. Then came the moment that changed everything. February 27th, 4:17 p.m., approximately 16 hours before the ultimatum deadline. Reuters reports that 6 of America's largest agricultural exporters have received informal notification from the Commerce Department to prepare for potential disruptions in Canadian market access within days. The notification is not official policy, but the leak signals that the White House is actively planning implementation of punitive measures, regardless of last-minute Canadian concessions. Canadian officials interpret this leak as confirmation that Trump never intended genuine negotiation and that the ultimatum was merely pretext for predetermined escalation. At 8:43 p.m., Carney convenes a second emergency cabinet meeting. Sources describe the Prime Minister as calm but resolved, making clear to ministers that Canada will not blink in the final hours before the deadline, and that any American escalation will be met immediately, with Canadian countermeasures already prepared by finance and trade officials. The meeting produces unanimous cabinet support for Carney's approach, with even ministers representing districts economically dependent on American trade expressing conviction that capitulating to ultimatums would create precedent, making Canadian sovereignty untenable. 11:59 p.m., February 27th. The deadline passes with no communication from Ottawa, no last-minute negotiation, no indication that Canada intends to modify its position in any way. For exactly 60 seconds, there is absolute silence from both capitals. Then, at 12:01 a.m. on February 28th, Mark Carney issues a one-sentence statement through the Prime Minister's office. The statement reads, "Canada does not respond to ultimatums. That's it. 11 words. No elaboration, no diplomatic softening, no opening for continued dialogue. Just absolute, unambiguous rejection." And it gets worse. At 7:47 a.m. this morning, exactly 7 hours and 46 minutes after the deadline passed, the Canadian government announced immediate implementation of what they are calling reciprocal trade fairness measures targeting American industries concentrated in Republican-controlled states. The measures include 25% tariffs on American aircraft parts manufactured in Washington state, 30% tariffs on American pharmaceuticals produced in New Jersey and Connecticut, and 20% tariffs on American financial services exported to Canadian markets. The targeting is surgical, deliberate, and according to trade analysts, designed to maximize political pain for Republican congressional districts while minimizing damage to Canadian consumers. But here's what concerns me most, and this is the detail that should terrify anyone who understands how quickly economic disputes between allies can spiral into genuine crisis. At 9:34 a.m., the European Union issued a statement expressing grave concern about unilateral American trade actions against Canada and suggesting that similar coercive approaches toward European allies would trigger immediate countermeasures from Brussels. The statement was coordinated with the German Finance Ministry and the French Foreign Ministry, according to sources familiar with the discussions, and represents the first time since Trump's first term that major European powers have publicly aligned with a non-American position in a US-allied dispute. At 10:17 a.m., Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum held a press conference announcing that Mexico stands in solidarity with Canada and warning that any attempt to impose similar ultimatums on Mexico City will result in immediate suspension of security cooperation on border enforcement and drug interdiction. This is significant because Trump has consistently used the threat of reduced Mexican cooperation on border security as leverage in trade negotiations, and Sheinbaum's statement removes that leverage entirely by making clear that cooperation depends on mutual respect rather than American threats. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because this story is about to get significantly more complicated, and you'll want to be here for all of it. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your like helps this reach more people who deserve to know what's really happening before mainstream media catches up with analysis that matters. At 1:12 p.m., just 86 minutes ago as I record this, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 634 points in the first hour of trading as markets absorbed the reality that the United States is now in an active trade war with its largest trading partner, and that the conflict is escalating rather than resolving. Currency markets are pricing in significant risk of prolonged disruption, with the UI Northern Note, and as investors question American diplomatic competence and alliance stability. Gold prices spiked to their highest level since 2024 as safe haven demand surged. What I'm about to show you next is what triggered the panic that is spreading through financial markets, diplomatic circles, and corporate boardrooms across the developed world. At 2:47 p.m., Bloomberg reported that the Bank of Canada has convened an emergency monetary policy committee meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning to assess potential response to economic disruption from the trade conflict. The fact that Canada's central bank is moving to emergency footing within hours of the tariff announcement signals that Canadian authorities are preparing for significant economic dislocation and are ready to deploy monetary tools to cushion the impact. But wait, there's something even worse I haven't told you yet. According to three sources with direct knowledge of discussions inside the White House, Trump is considering invoking emergency economic powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose comprehensive sanctions-style restrictions on Canadian financial institutions accessing US dollar clearing systems. This would represent an unprecedented weaponization of America's control over global financial infrastructure against a G7 ally, and would essentially treat Canada the way the United States treats adversarial nations like Iran or North Korea. Former Treasury officials who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations are describing this possibility as economic insanity that will permanently damage American credibility with every ally and potentially trigger the beginning of the end of dollar dominance in global trade. Legal scholars are calling this a watershed moment in alliance management. Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter, former State Department Director of Policy Planning and current CEO of New America, told reporters this morning that what Trump is attempting represents the most significant rupture in Western alliance cohesion since the Suez Crisis of 1956. And that is not hyperbole. Former NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who served from 2009 to 2014 and worked closely with both American and Canadian governments, issued a statement calling the ultimatum strategy catastrophically misguided and warning that America's NATO partners are watching closely to see whether Washington now views alliances as protection rackets rather than partnerships based on shared values and mutual benefit. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because this story is far from finished, and I will be covering every development as it breaks. When Trump announces his next move, when Carney responds, when markets react, when European leaders make their calculations, you will see detailed analysis here immediately. And what happens over the next 48 to 72 hours will determine whether we witness the fracturing of the North American alliance or whether someone blinks before catastrophic damage becomes permanent. Here's what I'm watching for in the next few hours that will tell us which direction this crisis is heading. First, whether Trump's inner circle can convince him that comprehensive financial sanctions against Canada would trigger immediate retaliation from European allies who would view such measures as proof that American financial hegemony represents an unacceptable vulnerability, requiring urgent diversification away from dollar-denominated systems. Second, whether Republican senators from states that will be devastated by Canadian counter-tariffs begin publicly breaking with the White House strategy, creating political pressure for de-escalation. Third, whether Mark Carney gives any indication that he might be willing to engage in face-saving diplomatic process that allows both sides to claim partial victory while backing away from the most damaging escalation scenarios. The next enforcement deadline hits in 96 hours when the Canadian tariffs officially take effect on Monday, March 3rd at 12:01 a.m. If those tariffs are implemented without any movement toward negotiation, the economic pain becomes real and immediate for American businesses, workers, and investors. Markets will price in prolonged conflict, supply chains will begin rerouting around Canadian sources, and the political pressure on Trump from affected industries will intensify dramatically. Let me bring this together because we are running out of time, and the clock is ticking faster than most people realize. What we witnessed over the past 72 hours was not a normal trade dispute between partners who temporarily disagree on tariff levels or regulatory standards. This was a fundamental test of whether the United States under Trump's leadership views alliances as relationships between sovereign equals or as hierarchical arrangements where American power entitles Washington to dictate terms to smaller partners regardless of mutual benefit or shared history. Mark Carney answered that question definitively. Canada will not accept the latter framework, even if the economic cost of resistance proves significant. The calculation Carney has made, according to sources familiar with his thinking, is that short-term economic pain is preferable to establishing precedent that Canadian sovereignty is negotiable whenever an American president decides to issue ultimatums. This is not reckless bravado. This is strategic judgment by someone who understands that capitulating to threats this time guarantees more extreme threats next time, and that the only way to preserve genuine partnership is to demonstrate that partnership requires mutual respect. There are 3 scenarios now on the table, and I want you to understand that each of these is a real possibility over the next week. Scenario 1. Full escalation. Probability 45%. Trump proceeds with comprehensive tariffs and potentially financial sanctions. Canada implements its prepared countermeasures targeting Republican states. European allies begin coordinating their own responses to signal that coercive American trade tactics will not be tolerated. Markets enter sustained decline as investors price in prolonged North American trade war. Supply chains fragment. Corporate investment freezes. The economic pain becomes severe enough that political pressure forces eventual negotiation, but not before inflicting billions in permanent damage and fundamentally altering alliance trust structures. If this happens, it represents the most significant self-inflicted wound to American economic interests and diplomatic credibility since the Iraq War, and the implications will reshape global trade architecture for decades. Scenario 2. Tactical retreat. Probability 30%. Republican senators from affected states, facing constituent fury as Canadian tariffs devastate local industries, publicly break with White House strategy and demand negotiation. Corporate lobbying intensifies as Fortune 500 companies with integrated North American supply chains warn of catastrophic disruption. Trump, facing potential legislative rebellion and market panic, agrees to suspend implementation of threatened measures in exchange for Canadian agreement to bilateral talks without preconditions.